use of ordinary nouns. Wholly is compounded of relations between their parts. Moreover, as soon as the child has learned to use correctly relational words, such as eat, he has become capable of being causally affected by a relational feature of the environment, which involves a new degree of complexity not required for the use of ordinary nouns. Thus, the correct use of relational words, i.e. of sentences, involves what may be correctly termed perception of form, i.e. it involves a definite reaction to a stimulus, which is a form. Suppose, for example, that a child has learned to say that one thing is above another, when this is in fact the case. The stimulus to the use of the word above is a relational feature of the environment, and we may say that this feature is perceived, since it produces a definite reaction. It may be said that the relation above is not very like the word above. That is true, but the same is true of ordinary physical objects. A stone, according to the physicists, is not at all like what we see when we look at it, and yet we may be correctly said to perceive it. This, however, is to anticipate. The definite point which has emerged is that when a person can use sentences correctly, that is a proof of sensitiveness to formal or relational stimuli. The structure of a sentence asserting some relational fact, such as this is above that, or Brutus killed Caesar, differs in an important respect from the structure of the fact which it asserts. Above is a relation which holds between the two terms this and that, but the word above is not a relation. In the sentence, the relation is the temporal order of words, or the spatial order that they are written, but the word for the relation is itself as substantial as other words. In inflected languages, such as Latin, the order of the words is not necessary to show the sense of the relation, but in uninflected languages, this is the only way of distinguishing between Brutus killed Caesar and Caesar killed Brutus. Words are physical phenomena, having spatial and temporal relations. We make use of these relations in our verbal symbolization of other relations, chiefly to show the sense of the relation, i.e. whether it goes from A to B or from B to A. A great deal of the confusion about relations which has prevailed in practically all philosophies comes from the fact, which we noticed just now, that relations are indicated not by other relations, but by words which in themselves are just like other words. Consequently, in thinking about relations,
we gotta go.
constantly hover between the unsubstantiality of the relation itself
Well, come on.
and the substantiality of
Thank
the
you, Jett.
word.
Just Willa.
Take, say, the fact that lightning
And-
precedes thunder. If we were to express this
Thank
by
you, Jett.
language closely reproducing the structure of the fact, we should have to say simply lightning, thunder. Where the fact that the first word precedes the second.
Hey,
means
thank
that
you,
what
April.
The first word means
All right.
precedes
Bye.
what the second
Bye,
word
Jett. Be good.
But even if we adopted this method for temporal order, we should still need words for all other relations, because we could not, without intolerable ambiguity, symbolize them also by the order of our words. All this will be important to remember when we come to consider the structure of the world, since nothing but a preliminary study of language will preserve us from being misled by language in our metaphysical speculations. Throughout this chapter, I have said nothing about the narrative and imaginative uses of words. I have dealt with words in connection with an immediate, sensible stimulus, closely connected with what they mean. The other uses of words are difficult to discuss until we have considered memory and imagination. In the present chapter, I have confined myself to a behavioristic explanation of the effects of words heard as stimuli, and the causes of words spoken when the words apply to something sensibly present. I think we shall find that other uses of words, such as the narrative and imaginative, involve only new applications of the law of association. But we cannot develop this theme until we have discussed several further psychological questions. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Philosophy by Bertrand Russell. The LibreVox recording is in the public domain. Perception, objectively regarded. It will be remembered that the task upon which we are at present engaged is the definition of knowledge as a phenomenon discoverable by an outside observer. When we have said what we can from this objective standpoint, we will ask ourselves whether anything further, and if so, what, is to be learned from the subjective standpoint, in which we take account of facts which can only be discovered when the observer and the observed are the same person. But for the present, we will resolutely confine ourselves to those facts about a human being which another human being can observe, together with such inferences as can be drawn from these facts. The word knowledge is very ambiguous. We say that Watson's rats know how to get out of mazes, that a child of 3 knows how to talk, that a man knows the people with whom he is acquainted, that he knows what he's had for breakfast this morning, and that he knows when Columbus first crossed the ocean. French and German are less ambiguous, since each has 2 words for different kinds of knowing, which we tend to confuse in our thoughts because we confuse them in our language. I shall not attempt as yet to deal with knowledge in general, but rather with certain less general concepts which would ordinarily be included under knowledge. And first of all, I will deal with perception, not as it appears to the perceiver, but as it can be tested by an outside observer. Let us try, first, to get a rough preliminary view of the sort of thing we are going to mean by perception. One may say that a man perceives anything that he notices through his senses. This is not a question of the sense organs alone, though they are a necessary condition. No man can perceive by sight what is not in his field of vision, but he may look straight at a thing without perceiving it. I have frequently had the experience, supposed to be characteristic of philosophers, of looking everywhere for my spectacles, although they were before my eyes when the search began. We cannot, therefore, tell what a man is perceiving by observing his sense organs alone, though they may enable us to know that he is not perceiving something. The observer can only know that a man is perceiving something if the man reacts in some appropriate manner. If I say to a man, "Please pass the mustard," and he thereupon passes it, it is highly probable that he perceived what I said, although it may, of course, be a mere coincidence that he passed it at that moment. But if I say to him, "The telephone number you want is 2467, and he proceeds to call that number, the odds against his doing so by mere chance are very great, roughly 10,000 to 1. And if a man reads aloud out of a book, and I look over his shoulder and perceive the same words, it becomes quite fantastic to suppose that he does not perceive the words he is uttering. We can thus, in many cases, achieve practical certainty as to some of the things that other people are perceiving. Perception is a species of a wider genus, namely sensitivity. Sensitivity is not confined to living things. In fact, it is best exemplified by scientific instruments. A material object is said to be sensitive to such and such a stimulus if, when the stimulus is present, it behaves in a way noticeably different from that in which it behaves in the absence of the stimulus. A photographic plate is sensitive to light, a barometer is sensitive to pressure, a thermometer to temperature, a galvanometer to electric current, and so on. In all these cases, we might say, in a certain metaphorical sense, that an instrument perceives the stimulus to which it is sensitive. We do not, in fact, say so. We feel that perception involves something more than we find in scientific instruments. What is this something more? The traditional answer would be consciousness. But this answer, right or wrong, is not what we are seeking at the moment, because we are considering the percipient as he appears to an outside observer, to whom his consciousness is only an inference. Is there anything in perception, as viewed from without, that distinguishes it from the sensitivity of a scientific instrument? There is, of course, the fact that human beings are sensitive to a greater variety of stimuli than any instrument. Each separate sense organ can be surpassed by something made artificially sensitive to its particular stimulus. Photographic plates can photograph stars that we cannot see. Clinical thermometers register differences of temperature that we cannot feel, and so on. But there was no way of combining a microscope, a microphone, a thermometer, a galvanometer, and so on into a single organism which will react in an integral manner to the combination of all the different stimuli that affect its different sense organs. This, however, is perhaps only a proof that our mechanical skill is not so great as it may in time become. It is certainly not enough to define the difference between a dead instrument and a living body. The chief difference, perhaps the only one from our present point of view, is that living bodies are subject to the law of association, or that of the conditioned reflex. Consider, for instance, an automatic machine. It has a reflex which makes it sensitive to pennies, in response to which it gives up chocolate. But it never learns to give up chocolate on merely seeing a penny or hearing the word penny. If you kept it in your house and said abracadabra to it every time you inserted a penny, it would not, in the end, be moved to action by the mere word abracadabra. Its reflexes remain unconditioned, as do some of ours, such as sneezing. But with us, sneezing is peculiar in this respect, hence its unimportance. Most of our reflexes can be conditioned, and the conditioned reflex can, in turn, be conditioned afresh, and so on, without limit. This is what makes the reactions of the higher animals, and especially of man, so much more interesting and complicated than the reactions of machines. Let us see whether this one law will suffice to distinguish perception from other forms of sensitivity. The variability in a human being's responses to a given stimulus has given rise to the traditional distinction between cognition and volition. When one's rich uncle comes for a visit, smiles are the natural response. After he's lost his money, a colder demeanor results from the new conditioning. Thus, the reaction to stimulus has come to be divided into two parts, one purely receptive and sensory, the other active and motor. Perception, as traditionally conceived, is, so to speak, the end term of the receptive sensory part of the reaction, while volition, in its widest sense, is the first term of the active motor part of the reaction. It was possible to suppose that the receptive part of the reaction would always be the same for the same stimulus, and that the difference, due to experience, would only arise in the motor part. The last term of the passive part, as it appears to the person concerned, was called sensation. But in fact, the influence of the law of conditioned reflexes goes much deeper than this theory supposed. As we saw, the contraction of the pupil, which is normally due to bright light, can be conditioned so as to result from a loud noise. What we see depends largely upon muscular adjustments of the eyes, which we make quite unconsciously. But apart from the contraction of the pupil, only one of them is a true reflex, namely, turning the eyes towards a bright light. This is a movement which children can perform on the day of their birth. I know this not merely from personal observation, but also, what is more, from the textbooks. But newborn infants cannot follow a moving light with their eyes, nor can they focus or accommodate. As a consequence, the purely receptive part of their reaction to visual objects, insofar as this reaction is visual, is different from that of adults or older children, whose eye muscles adjust themselves so as to see clearly. But here again, all sorts of factors enter in. Innumerable objects are in our field of vision, but only some, at most, are interesting to us. If someone says, "Look, there's a snake," we adjust our eyes afresh and obtain a new sensation. Then, when the purely visual part is finished, there are stimulations, by association, of other centers in the brain. There are pictures in Curler's book of apes watching other apes on top of insecure piles of boxes, and the spectators have their arms raised in sympathetic balancing movements. Anyone who watches gymnastics or skillful dancing is liable to experience sympathetic muscular contractions. Any visual object that we might be touching will stimulate incipient touch reactions, but the sun, moon, and stars do not. Conversely, visual reactions may be stimulated through association with other stimuli. When motor cars were still uncommon, I was walking one day with a friend when a tire punctured in our neighborhood with a loud report. He thought it was a revolver and averred that he had seen the flash. In dreams, this sort of mechanism operates uncontrolled. Some stimulus, say the noise of the maid knocking at the door, becomes interpreted in fantastic ways which are governed by association. I remember once dreaming that I was in an inn in the country in Germany and was awakened by a choir singing outside my window. Finally, I really woke and found that a spring shower was making a very musical noise on the roof. At least, I heard a very musical noise, and now reinterpreted it as a shower on the roof. This hypothesis I confirmed by looking out of the window. In waking life, we are critical of the interpretive hypotheses that occur to us, and therefore do not make such wild mistakes as in our dreams. But the creative, as opposed to the critical mechanism, is the same in waking life as it is in dreams. There is always far more richness in the experience than the sensory stimulus alone would warrant. All adaptation to environment acquired during the life of the individual might be regarded as learning to dream dreams that succeed rather than dreams that fail. The dreams we have when we are asleep usually end in a surprise. The dreams we have in waking life are less apt to do so. Sometimes they do, as when pride goes before a fall, but in that case they are regarded as showing maladjustment, unless there is some large external cause, such as an earthquake. One might say that a person properly adapted to his environment is one whose dreams never end in the sort of surprise that would wake him up. In that case, he will think that his dreams are objective reality. But if modern physics is to be believed, the dreams we call waking perceptions have only a very little more resemblance to objective reality than the fantastic dreams of sleep. They have some truth, but only just so much as is required to make them useful. Until we begin to reflect, we unhesitatingly assume that what we see is really there in the outside world, except in such cases as reflections in mirrors. Physics and the theory of the way in which perceptions are caused show that this naive belief cannot be quite true. Perception may, and I think does, enable us to know something of the outer world, but it is not the direct revelation that we naturally suppose it to be. We cannot go into this question adequately until we have considered what the philosopher has to learn from physics. I am merely giving, by anticipation, the reasons for regarding perception as a form of reaction to the environment, displayed in some bodily movement, rather than as a form of knowledge. When we have considered further what constitutes knowledge, we may find that perception is, after all, a form of knowledge, but only because knowledge is not quite what we naturally suppose it to be. For the present, let us stick to the view of perception that can be obtained by the external observer, i.e., as something displayed in the manner of reacting to the environment. From the point of view of the external observer, perception is established just like any other causal correlation. We observe that whenever a certain object stands in a certain spatial relation to a man's body, the man's body makes a certain movement. We shall then say that the man perceives the object. So the newborn baby turns its eyes slowly towards a bright light which is not in the center of the field of vision. This entitles us to say that the baby perceives the light. If he is blind, his eyes do not move in this way. A bird flying about in a wood does not bump into the branches, whereas in a room it will bump into the glass of the window. This entitles us to say that the bird perceives the branches, but not the glass. Do we perceive the glass, or do we merely know that it is there? This question introduces us to the complications produced by association. We know by experience, from the sense of touch, that there is usually glass in window frames. Thus, it makes us react to the window frames as if we could see the glass. But sometimes there is no glass, and still we shall perhaps behave as if there were. If this can happen, it shows that we do not perceive the glass, since our reaction is the same whether there is glass or not. If, however, the glass is colored, or slightly distorting, or not perfectly clean, a person accustomed to glass will be able to distinguish a frame containing a glass from one which has none. In that case, it is more difficult to decide whether we are to say that he perceives the glass or not. It is certain that perception is affected by experience. A person who can read perceives print where another would not. A musician perceives differences between notes which to an untrained ear are indistinguishable. People unaccustomed to the telephone cannot understand what they hear in it, but this is perhaps not really a case in point. The difficulty we are considering arises from the fact that a human body, unlike a scientific instrument, is perpetually changing its reaction to a given stimulus under the influence of the law of association. Moreover, the human body is always doing something. How, then, are we to know whether what it is doing is the result of a given stimulus or not? In most cases, however, this difficulty is not very serious, particularly when we are dealing with people old enough to speak. When you go to the oculist, he asks you to read a number of letters growing gradually smaller. At some point you fail. Where you have succeeded, he knows that you have perceived enough to make out what the letter is. Or you take a pair of compasses and press the points into a man's back, asking him if he feels 2 pricks or only 1. He may say 1 when the 2 points are near together. If he is on his guard against this error, he may say 2 when in fact there is only 1. But if the points are sufficiently far apart, he will never make a mistake. That is to say, the bodily movement consisting in pronouncing the word 2 will invariably result from a certain stimulus. Invariably, I mean, for a given subject on a given day. This entitles us to say that the man can perceive that there are 2 points, provided they are not too near together. Or you say, what can you see on the horizon? One man says, I see a ship. Another says, I see a steamer with 2 funnels. A third says, I see a Cunarder going from Southampton to New York. How much of what these 3 people say is to count as perception? They may all 3 be perfectly right in what they say, and yet we should not concede that a man can perceive that the ship is going from Southampton to New York. This, we should say, is inference. But it is by no means easy to draw a line. Some things which are, in an important sense, inferential, must be admitted to be perceptions. The man who says, I see a ship, is using inference. Apart from experience, he only sees a queerly shaped dark dot on a blue background. Experience has taught him that this sort of dot means a ship. That is to say, he has a conditioned reflex which causes him to utter, louder to himself, the word ship when his eye is stimulated in a certain way. To disentangle what is due to experience and what is not in the perceptions of an adult is a hopeless task. Practically, if a word comes without previous verbal intermediaries, the ordinary man would include what the word means in the perception, while he would not do so if the man arrives at the word after verbal preliminaries, overt or internal. But this itself is a question of familiarity. Show a child a pentagon, and he will have to count the sides to know how many there are. But after a little experience of geometrical figures, the word pentagon will arise without any previous words. And in any case, such a criterion is theoretically worthless. The whole affair is a matter of degree, and we cannot draw any sharp line between perception and inference. As soon as this is realized, our difficulties are seen to be purely verbal, and therefore unimportant. It will be observed that we are not attempting, at present, to say what constitutes perception, but only what kind of behavior on the part of a person whom we are observing will justify us in saying that he has perceived this or that feature of his environment. I suggest that we are justified in saying that a man perceives such a feature if, throughout some such period as a day, there is some bodily act which he performs whenever that feature is present, but not at any other time. This condition is clearly sufficient, but not necessary. That is to say, There may be perception even when it is not fulfilled. A man's reaction may change through conditioning even in so short a period as a day. Again, there may be a reaction, but one which is too slight to be observable. In this case, the criterion of perception is theoretically satisfied, but not practically, since no one can know that it is. We often have evidence later on that something was perceived, although at the moment there was no discoverable reaction. I have frequently known children repeat afterwards some remark which, at the time, they seemed not to have heard. This sort of case affords another kind of evidence of perception, namely the evidence afforded by a delayed response. Some people will sit silent and impassive in a company of talkers, giving no evidence that they are listening, yet they may go home and write down the conversation verbatim in their journals. These are the typical writers of memoirs. More remarkable still, I know one man, a man of genius it is true, who talks incessantly, who yet, after meeting a total stranger, knows exactly what the stranger would have said if he had been given the chance. How this is managed, I do not know, but such a man is rightly called perceptive. Obviously, in dealing with human beings old enough to talk, words afford the best evidence of perception. A man's verbal responses to perceptive situations do not change much after the first few years of life. If you see a kingfisher, and at the same moment your companion says, "There's a kingfisher," that is pretty conclusive evidence that he saw it. But as this case illustrates, our evidence that someone else has perceived something always depends upon our own perceptions, and our own perceptions are known to us in a different way from that in which the perceptions of others are known to us. This is one of the weak spots in the attempt at a philosophy from the objective standpoint. Such a philosophy really assumes knowledge as a going concern, and takes for granted the world which a man derives from his own perceptions. We cannot tackle all our philosophical problems by the objective method, but it is worthwhile to proceed with it as far as it will take us. This whole question of perception will have to be attacked afresh from a different angle, and we shall then find reason to regard the behavioristic standpoint as inadequate, though valid as far as it goes. We still have, however, a long road to go before we shall be driven to consider the subjective standpoint. More particularly, we have to define knowledge and inference behavioralistically, and then, making a new start, to consider what modern physics makes of matter. But for the moment, there are still some things to be said about perception from the objective standpoint. It will be seen that, according to our criterion of perception, an object perceived need not be in contact with the percipient's body. The sun, moon, and stars are perceived according to the above criterion. In order, however, that an object not in contact with the body should be perceived, there are physical as well as physiological conditions to be fulfilled. There must be some physical process which takes place at the surface of the body when the object in question is suitably situated, but not otherwise. And there must be sense organs capable of being affected by such a process. There are, as we know from physics, many processes which fulfill the necessary physical conditions, but fail to affect us through the inadequacy of our sense organs. Waves of a certain sort make sound, but waves of exactly the same sort become inaudible if they are too short. Waves of a certain sort make light, but if they are too long or too short, they are invisible. The waves used in wireless are of the same sort as those that make light, but are too long. There is no reason, a priori, why we should not be aware of wireless messages through our senses, without the need of instruments. X-rays are also of the same sort as those that make light, but in this case, they are too short to be seen. They might render the objects from which they come visible if we had a different sort of eye. We are not sensible to magnetism unless it is enormously powerful, but if we had more iron in our bodies, we might have no need of the mariner's compass. Our senses are a haphazard selection of those that the nature of physical processes renders possible. One may suppose that they have resulted from chance variation in the struggle for existence. it is important to observe that our perceptions are very largely concerned with form or shape or structure. This is the point emphasized by what is called Gestaltpsychologie, or psychology of form. Reading is a case in point. Whether we read black letters on white paper or white letters on a blackboard is a matter which we hardly notice. It is the forms of the letters that affect us, not their color or their size, so long as they remain legible. In this matter, the sense of sight is preeminent, although blind men, and others to a less degree, can acquire a good knowledge of form by the sense of touch. Another point of importance about our perceptions is that they give us, within limits, a knowledge of temporal sequence. If you say to a man, Brutus killed Caesar, and then Caesar killed Brutus, the difference between the two statements is likely to be perceived by him, if he is listening. In the one case, he will say, of course. In the other, nonsense, which is evidence of his having different perceptions in the two cases, according to our definition. Further, if you ask him what the difference is, he can tell you that it is a difference in the order of the words. Thus, time order within a short period of time is clearly perceptible. The objective method, which we've been applying in this chapter, is the only possible one in studying the perceptions of animals or of infants before they can talk. Many animals, too low in the scale of evolution to have eyes, are yet sensitive to light, in the sense that they move towards it or move away from it. Such animals, according to our criterion, perceive light, though there is no reason to suppose that they perceive color or visual form or anything beyond the bare presence of light. We can perceive the bare presence of light when our eyes are shut. Perhaps one may imagine their sensitiveness to be more or less analogous in its limitations. It is not to be supposed, in any case, that perceiving an object involves knowing what it is like. That is quite another matter. We shall see later that certain inferences of a highly abstract character can be drawn from our perceptions to the objects perceived. But these inferences are at once difficult and not quite certain. The idea that perception in itself reveals the character of objects is a fond delusion, and one, moreover, which it is very necessary to overcome if our philosophy is to be anything more than a pleasant fairy tale. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Philosophy by Bertrand Russell. The LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Memory objectively regarded. We are concerned in these chapters with what we can know about other men by merely observing their behavior. In this chapter, I propose to consider everything that would commonly be called memory, insofar as it can be made a matter of external observation. And perhaps it may be as well, at this point, to state my own view of the question of behaviorism. This philosophy, of which the chief protagonist is Dr. John B. Watson, holds that everything that can be known about man is discoverable by the methods of external observation, i.e., that none of our knowledge depends essentially and necessarily upon data in which the observer and the observed are the same person. I do not fundamentally agree with this view, but I think it contains much more truth than most people suppose, and I regard it as desirable to develop the behaviorist method to the fullest possible extent. I believe that the knowledge to be obtained by this method, so long as we take physics for granted, is self-contained, and need not, at any point, appeal to data derived from introspection, i.e., from observations which a man can make upon himself, but not upon anyone else. Nevertheless, I hold that there are such observations, and that there is a knowledge which depends upon introspection. What is more, I hold that data of this kind are required for a critical exposition of physics, which behaviorism takes for granted. I shall, therefore, after setting forth the behaviorist view of man, proceed to a scrutiny of our knowledge of physics, returning thence to man, but now as viewed from within. Then, finally, I shall attempt to draw conclusions as to what we know of the universe in general. The word memory, or remembering, is commonly used in a number of different senses, which it is important to distinguish. More especially, there is a broad sense in which the word applies to the power of repeating any habitual act previously learned, and a narrow sense in which it applies only to recollection of past events. It is in the broad sense that people speak of a dog remembering his master or his name, and that Sir Francis Darwin spoke of memory in plants. Samuel Butler used to attribute the sort of behavior that would usually be called instinctive to memory of ancestral experience, and evidently he was using the word memory in its widest possible sense. Bergson, on the contrary, dismisses habit memory as not true memory at all. True memory, for him, is confined to the recollection of a past occurrence, which, he maintains, cannot be a habit, since the event remembered only occurred once. The behaviorist maintains that this contention is mistaken, and that all memory consists in the retention of a habit. For him, therefore, memory is not something requiring special study, but is merged into the study of habit. Dr. Watson says, "The behaviorist never uses the term memory. He believes that it has no place in an objective psychology." He proceeds to give instances, beginning with a white rat in a maze. On the first occasion, he says, it took this rat 40 minutes to get out of the maze, but after 35 trials, he learned to get out in 6 seconds without taking any wrong turnings. He was then kept away from the maze for 6 months, and on being put in it again, he got out in 2 minutes with 6 mistakes. He was just as good as he had been before at the 20th trial. We have here a measure of the extent to which the habit of the maze had been retained. A similar experiment with a monkey showed even more retentiveness. He was put into a problem box which, at first, took him 20 minutes to open, but at the 20th trial he opened it in 2 seconds. He was then kept away from it for 6 months, and on being put back in it, he opened it in 4 seconds. With human beings, we know that many of the habits we learn are retained through long periods of disuse. Skating, bicycling, swimming, golf, etc. are familiar instances. Perhaps Dr. Watson goes a trifle too far when he says, if a poor shot or an inexpert golfer tells you that he was good 5 years ago, but that lack of practice has made him poor, don't believe him. He never was good. At any rate, this is not the belief of violinists and pianists, who consider it essential to practice every day. But even if it be somewhat of an exaggeration, it is certainly true that we retain bodily habits pretty well. Some, such as swimming, seem to be more completely retained than others. The power of talking a foreign language, for example, is one which is greatly impaired by disuse. The whole matter is quantitative and easily tested by experiment. But memory, in the sense of recollection of past events, if it can be explained as a habit, will have, one might suppose, to be a verbal habit. As to this, Dr. Watson says, what the man on the street ordinarily means by an exhibition of memory is what occurs in some such situation as this. An old friend comes to see him after many years' absence. The moment he sees this friend, he says, "Upon my life, Addison Sims of Seattle, I haven't seen you since the World's Fair in Chicago. Do you remember the gay parties we used to have in the Wilderness Hotel? Do you remember the Midway? Do you remember, etc. ad infinitum?" The psychology of this process is so simple that it seems almost an insult to your intelligence to discuss it. And yet, a good many of the behaviorist's kindly critics have said that behaviorism cannot adequately explain memory. Let us see if this is a fact. He goes on to say that during the period, long ago, when the man on the street was seeing Mr. Sims, they formed verbal and manual habits towards one another, so that finally, just the sight of the man, even after months of absence, would call out not only the old verbal habits, but many other types of bodily and visceral responses. He sums up. By memory, then, we mean nothing except the fact that when we meet a stimulus again after an absence, we do the old habitual thing. say the old words, and show the old visceral emotional behavior that we learned to do when we were in the presence of that stimulus in the first place. This theory is preferable to ordinary psychological theories in many ways. In the first place, it is not an attempt to treat memory as some sort of mystical faculty, and does not suppose that we are always remembering everything that we should remember if a suitable stimulus were applied. It is concerned with the causation of specific acts of remembering, these acts being all externally observable. I do not see any good reason to question it. Bergson's contention that the recollection of a unique occurrence cannot be explained by habit is clearly fallacious. There are many instances, both with animals and with human beings, of a habit becoming firmly established through one experience. It is therefore quite possible that a stimulus associated with a previous occurrence should set going a train of bodily events, which, in turn, produce words describing that occurrence. There is here, however, a difficulty. The memory of a past occurrence cannot be a verbal habit, except when the occurrence has been frequently related. When Watson's man on the street says, "Do you remember the Midway?" he is not using words that have become habitual. Very likely he never used these words before. He is using words which a verbal habit associates with an event that is now happening in him, and the event is called up by a habit associated with Mr. Sims. So, at least, we must suppose, if we accept Watson's view. But this diminishes the plausibility and the verifiability of his view. It is not our actual language that can be regarded as habitual, but only what our words express. In repeating a poem we have learned by heart, the language is habitual, but not so when we recount a past incident in words we never used before. In this case, it is not the actual words that we repeat, but only their meaning. The habitual element, therefore, if it really accounts for the recollection, must not be sought in words. This is something of a difficulty in the Watsonian theory of language. When a rat learns a maze, it learns certain definite bodily movements. So do we when we learn by heart. But I may say to one person, "I met Mr. Jones in the train today," and to another, "Joseph was in the 9:35 this morning." With the exception of the words "in the," these two sentences have nothing verbally in common, yet they may relate the same fact, and I may use either indifferently when I recall the fact. Thus, my recollection is certainly not a definite verbal habit. Yet words are the only overt bodily movements by which I make known my recollections to other people. If the behaviorist tells me that my recollection is bodily habit, and begins by telling me that it is a verbal habit, he can be driven by such instances to the admission that it must be some other kind of habit. If he says this, he is abandoning the region of observable fact, and taking refuge in hypothetical bodily movements invoked to save a theory. But these are hardly any better than thoughts. This question is more general than the problem of memory. Many different forms of words may be used to express the same meaning, and there seems to be no reason in mere habit to account for the fact that we sometimes use one form of words and sometimes another, when we think of that which all the various forms of words express. The association seems to go not direct from stimulus to words, but from stimulus to meaning, and thence to words expressing the meaning. You may, for instance, be quite unable to recollect whether you were told Jacob is older than Joseph, or Joseph is younger than Jacob, though you may remember quite definitely that you were told the fact which both these forms of words express. Again, if you are learning, say, a proof of a mathematical theorem, you do not learn by heart what the book says unless you are a very bad mathematician. You learn, as people say, to understand the proof, and then you can reproduce it in symbols quite different from those in the book. It is such facts, among others, that make it difficult to explain the mechanism of association, whether in memory or in thought in general. if we assume that words, or even sentences, are the terms associated. Perhaps, however, the theory as to the meaning of words, which we developed in an earlier chapter, may help us out of the difficulty. We define the meaning of a word by means of its associations. Therefore, if two words are synonyms, they have the same associations, and any stimulus which calls up one may also call up the other. The question which of the two synonyms we use will then depend upon some extraneous circumstance. This is all very well so far as single words are concerned. It would account satisfactorily, for instance, for the fact that I call a man sometimes by his surname and sometimes by his Christian name. But it is hardly so adequate when we come to the question of sentences. To revert to the illustration of a moment ago, in response to the stimulus, "Did anything happen on your journey?" you may say either, "I met Mr. Jones in the train today," or "Joseph was in the 9:35 this morning," or any one of an indefinite number of other sentences expressing the same occurrence. Are we to suppose that while you were in the train, you were rehearsing all these different sentences to yourself, so that each of them became firmly associated with the words "journey today"? Clearly, such a supposition would be absurd. Yet all the separate words of your sentence have many other associations. It is only the sentence as a whole that is associated with your journey. You have met other people besides Mr. Jones. You have had other contacts with Mr. Jones besides meeting him this morning. Train and today equally are appropriate to other occurrences that you might relate. Thus, it has to be the whole sentence that is the associative unit, and yet the sentence may never have been in your head before. It seems clear that it is possible to state in words something that you remember, although you never put it into words before. Suppose I say, "What did you have for breakfast today?" Probably you will be able to tell me, though it is very likely that you have not given names to the things you ate until this moment. The whole matter is connected with the distinction between sentences and single words, which we found important when we were discussing language. But even when we confine ourselves to single words, there are difficulties in Dr. Watson's view. Cases are alleged in which children, after learning to speak, can recall incidents which occurred before they could speak and describe them in correct words. This would show that the memory had persisted in a non-verbal form throughout the period before they learned to speak, and had only subsequently found verbal expression. Such extreme incidents are rare and might be questioned, but in a less extreme form, it ought not to be difficult to obtain examples of the same sort of thing. Suppose, for example, that a young child hurt his wrist badly before he knew the word wrist, and that sometime afterwards he learnt it. I should not be surprised if he could relate that he had hurt his wrist. Such instances, however, would not refute the essence of Watson's theory. He would allow visceral memory, for example, and the association with the word wrist might be grafted onto this. The real difficulty in Dr. Watson's view, to my mind, is the fact that our sentence may vary verbally as much as it likes, so long as it retains the same meaning, and that we clearly do not rehearse to ourselves beforehand all the possible sentences having the meaning in question. It should be realized that behaviorism loses much of its attractiveness if it is compelled to postulate movements that no one can observe, and that there is no other reason to assume. Dr. Broad, in his book on the mind and its place in nature, distinguishes between molar and molecular behaviorism. The former assumes only such bodily movements as can be observed, while the latter allows and utilizes hypothetical minute movements, more especially in the brain. Now here we must make a distinction. Physics believes in a large number of phenomena which are too minute to be observed, even with the strongest microscope. And if physics is at all correct, there must be minute movements in all parts of the human body, of a sort which we can never hope to see. We cannot reasonably demand of the behaviorist that he should abstain from a hypothesis which physics asserts for very good reasons. And in the process, which leads from stimulus to reaction, there are bound to be small occurrences in the brain which, though they cannot be observed, are essential to the physiological explanation of what occurs. But when the behaviorist assumes small occurrences for which there is no ground in physics, and which are needed solely in order to safeguard his theory, he is in a less strong position. Dr. Watson asserts, for instance, that whenever we think, there are small movements in the larynx, which are the beginnings of the movements we should make if we spoke words out loud. It may be that this is true. Certainly, I am not prepared to deny it. But I am not prepared to say that it must be true, merely because if it were not, behaviorism would be false. We do not know in advance that behaviorism is true. We have to find out whether it will explain observed facts. Whenever it has to postulate something unobserved, merely in order to avoid a refutation, it weakens its case. And if it maintains, as from Dr. Watson's language it seems to do, that we only remember an occurrence by forming a verbal habit in connection with it, then it is obliged to postulate much implicit use of words of which we have no evidence. To sum up this discussion, while it is quite possible by behaviorist methods to ascertain whether a person remembers a past occurrence or not, unless he is deliberately obstructing the observer, and while much memory can be quite adequately explained as habit, there do seem to be great difficulties in the view that memory consists entirely of habit, at least in the case of the recollection of an event. These difficulties seem insuperable if we suppose memory to be essentially a verbal habit. They are not insuperable if we postulate sufficient minute unobservable bodily movements. We have not considered whether they can be overcome by introducing data derived from introspection, since we wish, for the present, to maintain a strictly objective attitude to human behavior. The introspective discussion of memory will be taken up at a later stage. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Philosophy by Bertrand Russell. This LibreVox recording is in the public domain. Inference is a habit. In this chapter, we are concerned with inference as it can be observed when practiced by someone else. Inference is supposed to be a mark of intelligence and to show the superiority of men to machines. At the same time, the treatment of inference in traditional logic is so stupid as to throw doubt on this claim, and syllogistic inference, which was taken as the type from Aristotle to Bacon, exclusive, is just the sort of thing that a calculating machine could do better than a professor. In syllogistic inference, you are supposed to know already that all men are mortal and that Socrates is a man. Hence, you deduce, what you never suspected before, that Socrates is mortal. This form of inference does actually occur, though very rarely. The only instance I have ever heard of was supplied by Dr. F.C.S. Schiller. He once produced a comic number of the philosophical periodical Mind, and sent copies to various philosophers, among others to a certain German, who was much puzzled by the advertisements. But at last he argued, everything in this book is a joke, therefore the advertisements are jokes. I have never come across any other case of new knowledge obtained by means of a syllogism. It must be admitted that for a method which dominated logic for 2,000 years, this contribution to the world's stock of information cannot be considered very weighty. The inferences that we actually make in daily life differ from those of syllogistic logic in two respects, namely, that they are important and precarious instead of being trivial and safe. The syllogism may be regarded as a monument to academic timidity. If an inference might be wrong, it was dangerous to draw it. So the medieval monks, in their thinking as in their lives, sought safety at the expense of fertility. With Renaissance, a more adventurous spirit came into the world, but at first, in philosophy, it only took the form of following Greeks other than Aristotle, and more especially Plato. It is only with Bacon and Galileo that the inductive method arrived at due recognition. With Bacon as a program which was largely faulty, but with Galileo as something which actually led to brilliant results, namely the foundation of modern mathematical physics. Unfortunately, when the pedants got hold of induction, they set to work to make it as tame and scholastic as deduction had been. They searched for a way of making it always lead to true results, and in so doing, robbed it of its adventurous character. Hume turned upon them with skeptical arguments, proving quite conclusively that if an induction is worth making, it may be wrong. Thereupon, Kant deluged the philosophic world with muddle and mystery, from which it is only now beginning to emerge. Kant has the reputation of being the greatest of modern philosophers, but to my mind, he was a mere misfortune. Induction, as it appears in the textbooks, consists, roughly speaking, in the inference that because A and B have been found often together and never apart, therefore they are probably always together, and either may be taken as a sign of the other. I do not wish, at this stage, to examine the logical justification of this form of argumentation. For the present, I am considering it as a practice, which we can observe in the habits of men and animals. As a practice, induction is nothing but our old friend, the law of conditioned reflexes, or of association. A child touches a knob that gives him an electric shock. After that, he avoids touching the knob. If he is old enough to speak, he may state that the knob hurts when it is touched. He has made an induction based on a single instance. But the induction will exist as a bodily habit, even if he is too young to speak, and it occurs equally among animals, provided they are not too low in the scale. The theories of induction in logic are what Freudians call a rationalization. That is to say, they consist of reasons invented afterwards to prove that what we have been doing is sensible. It does not follow that they are bad reasons. In view of the fact that we and our ancestors have managed to exist since the origin of life, our behavior and theirs must have been fairly sensible, even if we and they were unable to prove that it was. This, however, is not the point that concerns us at present. What concerns us at present is the fact that verbal induction is a late development of induction in behavior, which is nothing more or less than the principle of learned reactions. This principle, as the reader will remember, states that if a certain event calls out a certain response, and if another event is experienced just before it, or at the same moment, in time, that other event will tend to call out the response which originally only the first event would call out. This applies both to muscles and to glands. It is because it applies to glands that words are capable of causing emotions. Moreover, we cannot set limits to the length of the chain of associations that may be established. If you hold an infant's limbs, you call out a rage reaction. This appears to be an unlearned reaction. If you and no one else repeatedly hold an infant's limbs, the mere sight of you will call out a rage reaction after a time. When the infant learns to talk, your name may have the same effect. If later he learns that you are an optician, he may come to hate all opticians. This may lead him to hate Spinoza because he made spectacles, and thence he may come to hate metaphysicians and Jews. For doing so, he will no doubt have the most admirable reasons, which will seem to him to be his real ones. He will never suspect the process of conditioning by which he has in fact arrived at his enthusiasm for the Ku Klux Klan. This is an example of conditioning in the emotional sphere, but it is rather in the muscular sphere that we must seek the origin of the practice of induction. Domestic animals which are habitually fed by a certain person will run towards that person as soon as they see him. We say that they expect food, and in fact their behavior is very like what it would be if they saw food. But really, we have only an example of conditioning. They have often seen first the farmer and then the food, so that in time they react to the farmer as they originally reacted to the food. Infants soon learn to react to the sight of the bottle, although at first they only react to the touch of it. When they can speak, the same law makes them say dinner when they hear the dinner bell. It is quite unnecessary to suppose that they first think, that bell means dinner, and then say dinner. The sight of dinner, by previous learned reaction, causes the word dinner. The bell frequently precedes the sight of dinner, therefore, in time, the bell produces the word dinner. It is only subsequent reflection, probably at a much later age, that makes the child say, I knew dinner was ready because I heard the bell. Long before he can say this, he is acting as if he knew it, and there is no good reason for denying that he knows it when he acts as if he did. If knowledge is to be displayed by behavior, there is no reason to confine ourselves to verbal behavior as the sole kind by which knowledge can manifest itself. The situation, stated abstractly, is as follows. Originally, stimulus A produced stimulus C. Now stimulus B produces it as a result of association. Thus, B has become a sign of A, in the sense that it causes the behavior appropriate to A. All sorts of things may be signs of other things, but with human beings, words are the supreme example of signs. All signs depend upon some practical induction. Whenever we read or hear a statement, its effect upon us depends upon induction in this sense, since the words are signs of what they mean, in the sense that we react to them, in certain respects, as we should to what they stand for. If someone says to you, your house is on fire, the effect upon you is practically the same as if you saw the conflagration. You may, of course, be the victim of a hoax, and in that case your behavior will not be such as achieves any purpose you have in view. This risk of error exists always, since the fact that two things have occurred together in the past cannot prove conclusively that they will occur together in the future. Scientific induction is an attempt to regularize the above process, which we may call physiological induction. It is obvious that, as practiced by animals, infants, and savages, physiological induction is a frequent source of error. There is Dr. Watson's infant, who induced from two examples that whenever he saw a certain rat, there would be a loud noise. There is Edmund Burke, who induced from one example, Cromwell, that revolutions lead to military tyrannies. There are savages who argue from one bad season that the arrival of a white man causes bad crops. The inhabitants of Siena in 1348 thought that the Black Death was a punishment for their pride in starting to build too large a cathedral. Of such examples there is no end. It is very necessary, therefore, if possible, to find some method by which induction can be practiced so as to lead, in general, to correct results. But this is a problem of scientific method, with which we will not yet concern ourselves. What does concern us at present is the fact that all inference of the sort that really occurs is a development of this one principle of conditioning. In practice, inference is of two kinds, one typified by induction, the other by mathematical reasoning. The former is by far the more important, since, as we have seen, it covers all use of signs and all empirical generalizations, as well as the habits of which they are the verbal expression. I know that, from the traditional standpoint, it seems absurd to talk of inference in most cases of this sort. For example, you find it stated in the paper that such and such a horse has won the Derby. According to my own use of words, you practice an induction when you arrive thence at a belief that the horse has won. The stimulus consists of certain black marks on white paper, or perhaps on pink paper. The stimulus is only connected with horses in the Derby by association, yet your reaction is one appropriate to the Derby. Traditionally, there was only inference where there was a mental process, which, after dwelling upon the premises, was led to assert the conclusion by means of insight into their logical connection. I am not saying that the process, which such words as the above are intended to describe, never takes place. It certainly does. What I am saying is that genetically and causally, there is no important difference between the most elaborate induction and the most elementary learned reaction. The one is merely a developed form of the other, not something radically different. And our determination to believe in the results of inductions, even if, as logicians, we see no reason to do so, is really due to the potency of the principle of association. It is an example, perhaps the most important example, of what Dr. Santayana calls animal faith. The question of mathematical reasoning is more difficult. I think we may lay it down that in mathematics, the conclusion always asserts merely the whole or part of the premises, although usually in new language. The difficulty of mathematics consists in seeing that this is so in particular cases. In practice, the mathematician has a set of rules according to which his symbols can be manipulated, and he acquires technical skill in working according to the rules in the same sort of way as a billiard player does. But there is a difference between mathematics and billiards. The rules of billiards are arbitrary, whereas in mathematics, some, at least, are in some sense true. A man cannot be said to understand mathematics unless he has seen that these rules are right. Now, what does this consist of? I think it is only a more complicated example of the process of understanding that Napoleon and Bonaparte refer to the same person. To explain this, however, we must revert to what was said in the chapter on language about the understanding of form. Human beings possess the power of reacting to form. No doubt some of the higher animals also possess it, though to nothing like the same extent as men do. And all animals, except a few of the most intelligent species, appear to be nearly devoid of it. Among human beings, it differs greatly from one individual to another, and increases as a rule up to adolescence. I should take it as what chiefly characterizes intellect. But let us see first in what the power consists. When a child is being taught to read, he learns to recognize a given letter, say H, whether it is large or small, black or white or red. However it may vary in these respects, his reaction is the same. He says H. That is to say, the essential feature in the stimulus is its form. When my boy, at the age of just under 3, was about to eat a 3-cornered piece of bread and butter, I told him it was a triangle. His slices were generally rectangular. Next day, unprompted, he pointed to triangular bits in the pavement of the Albert Memorial and called them triangles. Thus, the form of the bread and butter, as opposed to its edibility, its softness, its color, etc., was what had impressed him. This sort of thing constitutes the most elementary kind of reaction to form. Now, matter and form can be placed, as in the Aristotelian philosophy, in a hierarchy. From a triangle, we can advance to a polygon, thence to a figure, thence to a manifold of points. Then we can go on and turn point into a formal concept, meaning something that has relations which resemble spatial relations in certain formal respects. Each of these is a step away from matter and further into the region of form. At each stage, the difficulty increases. The difficulty consists in having a uniform reaction, other than boredom, to a stimulus of this kind. When we understand a mathematical expression, that means that we can react to it in an appropriate manner. In fact, that it has meaning for us. This is also what we mean by understanding the word cat. But it is easier to understand the word cat because the resemblances between different cats are a sort which causes even animals to have a unique reaction to all cats. When we come to algebra and have to operate with x and y, there is a natural desire to know what x and y really are. That, at least, was my feeling. I always thought the teacher knew what they really were, but would not tell me. To understand even the simplest formula in algebra, say x plus y, in parentheses, squared, equals x squared plus 2xy plus y squared, is to be able to react to two sets of symbols in virtue of the form which they express, and to perceive that the form is the same in both cases. This is a very elaborate business, and it is no wonder that boys and girls find algebra a bugbear. But there is no novelty in principle after the first elementary perceptions of form. And perception of form consists merely in reacting alike to two stimuli which are alike in form, but very different in other respects. For when we can do that, we can say on the appropriate occasion, that is a triangle. And this is enough to satisfy the examiner that we know what a triangle is, unless he is so old-fashioned as to expect us to reproduce the verbal definition, which is, of course, a far easier matter, in which, with patience, we might even teach a parent to succeed. The meanings of complex mathematical symbols are always fixed by rules in relation to the meaning of simpler symbols. Thus, their meanings are analogous to those of sentences, not to those of single words. What was said earlier about the understanding of sentences applies, therefore, to any group of symbols which, in mathematics, will be declared to have the same meaning as another group, or part of that meaning. We may sum up this discussion by saying that mathematical inference consists in attaching the same reactions to two different groups of signs, whose meanings are fixed by convention in relation to their constituent parts, whereas induction consists, first, in taking something as a sign of something else, and later, when we have learned to take A as a sign of B, in taking A as also a sign of C. Thus, the usual cases of induction and deduction are distinguished by the fact that, in the former, the inference consists in taking one sign as a sign of two different things, while in the latter, the inference consists in taking two different signs as signs of the same thing. This statement is a little too antithetical to be taken as an exact expression of the whole truth in the matter. What is true, however, is that both kinds of inferences are concerned with the relation of a sign to what it signifies, and therefore come within the scope of the law of association. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Philosophy by Bertrand Russell. The Sleeper Fox recording is in the public domain. Knowledge behavioristically considered. The word knowledge, like the word memory, is avoided by the behaviorist. Nevertheless, there is a phenomenon commonly called knowledge, which is tested behavioristically in examinations. I want to consider this phenomenon in this chapter, with a view to deciding whether there is anything in it that the behaviorist cannot deal with adequately. It will be remembered that in Chapter 2, we were led to the view that knowledge is a characteristic of the complete process from stimulus to reaction, or even, in the cases of sight and hearing, from an external object to a reaction, the external object being connected with the stimulus by a chain of physical causation in the outer world. Let us, for the moment, leave on one side such cases as sight and hearing, and confine ourselves, for the sake of definiteness, to knowledge derived from touch. We can observe touch-producing reactions in quite humble animals, such as worms and sea anemones. Are we to say that they have knowledge of what they touch? In some sense, yes. Knowledge is a matter of degree. When it is regarded in a purely behavioristic manner, we shall have to concede that it exists, in some degree, wherever there is a characteristic reaction to a stimulus of a certain kind, and this reaction does not occur in the absence of the right kind of stimulus. In this sense, knowledge is indistinguishable from sensitivity, which we considered in connection with perception. We might say that a thermometer knows the temperature, and that a compass knows the direction of the magnetic north. This is the only sense in which, on grounds of observation, we can attribute knowledge to animals that are low in the scale. Many animals, for example, hide themselves when exposed to light, but as a rule not otherwise. In this, however, they do not differ from a radiometer. No doubt the mechanism is different, but the observed molar motion has similar characteristics. Wherever there is a reflex, an animal may be said, in a sense, to know the stimulus. This is, no doubt, not the usual sense of knowledge, but it is the germ out of which knowledge in the usual sense has grown, and without which no knowledge would be possible. Knowledge in any more advanced sense is only possible as a result of learning, in the sense considered in Chapter 3. The rat that has learned the maze knows the way out of it. The boy who has learned certain verbal reactions knows the multiplication table. Between these two cases, there is no important difference. In both cases, we say that the subject knows something because he reacts in a manner advantageous to himself, in which he could not react before he had had certain experiences. I do not think, however, that we ought to use a notion such as advantageous in connection with knowledge. What we can observe, for instance, with the rat in the maze, is violent activity until the food is reached, followed by eating when it is reached, also a gradual elimination of acts which do not lead to the food. Where this sort of behavior is observed, we may say that it is directed towards the food, and that the animal knows the way to the food when he gets to it by the shortest possible route. But if this view is right, we cannot define any knowledge acquired by learning except with reference to circumstances toward which an animal's activity is directed. We should say popularly that the animal desires such circumstances. Desire, like knowledge, is capable of a behavioristic definition, and it would seem that the two are correlative. Let us then spend a little time on the behavioristic treatment of desire. The best example of desire from this point of view is hunger. The stimulus to hunger is a certain well-ascertained bodily condition. When in this condition, an animal moves restlessly. If he sees or smells food, he moves in a manner which, in conditions to which he is accustomed, would bring him to the food. If he reaches it, he eats it. And if the quantity is sufficient, he then becomes quiescent. This kind of behavior may be summarized by saying that a hungry animal desires food. It is behavior which is in various ways different from that of inanimate matter, because restless movements persist until a certain condition is realized. These movements may or may not be best adapted to realizing the condition in question. Everyone knows about the pike that was put on one side of a glass partition with minnows on the other side. He continually bumped his nose on the glass, and after 6 weeks gave up the attempt to catch them. When, after this, the partition was removed, he still refrained from pursuing them. I do not know whether the experiment was tried of leaving a possibility of getting to the minnows by a roundabout route. To have learned to take a roundabout route would perhaps have required a degree of intelligence beyond the capacity of fishes. This is a matter, however, which offers little difficulty to dogs or monkeys. What applies to hunger applies equally to other forms of desire. Every animal has a certain congenital apparatus of desires. That is to say, in certain bodily conditions, he is stimulated to restless activities which tend towards the performance of some reflex. And if a given situation is often repeated, the animal arrives more and more quickly at the performance of the reflex. This last, however, is only true of the higher animals. In the lower, the whole process, from beginning to end, is reflex, and can therefore only succeed in normal circumstances. The higher animals, and more especially men, have a larger proportion of learning and a smaller proportion of reflexes in their behavior, and are therefore better able to adapt themselves to new circumstances. The helplessness of infants is a necessary condition for the adaptability of adults. Infants have fewer useful reflexes than the young of animals, but have far more power of forming useful habits, which can be adapted to circumstances and are not fatally fixed from birth. This fact is intimately connected with the superiority of human intelligence above that of the brutes. Desire is extremely subject to conditioning. If A is a primitive desire, and B has on many occasions been a means to A, B comes to be desired in the same sense in which A was previously desired. It may even happen, as in misers, that the desire for B completely displaces the desire for A, so that B, when attained, is no longer used as a means to A. This, however, is more or less exceptional. In general, the desire for A persists, although the desire for B has a more or less independent life. The conditioning of primitive desires in human beings is the source of much that distinguishes our life from that of animals. Most animals only seek food when they are hungry. They may then die of starvation before they find it. Men, on the contrary, must have early acquired pleasure in hunting as an art. They must have set out on hunting expeditions before they were actually hungry. A further stage in the conditioning of hunger came with domestic animals. A still further stage with agriculture. Nowadays, when a man sets to work to earn his living, his activity is still connected, though not very directly, with hunger and the other primitive desires that can be gratified by means of money. These primitive desires are still, so to speak, the power station, though their energy is widely distributed to all sorts of undertakings that seem, at first sight, to have no connection with them. Consider freedom and the political activities it inspires. This is derivable, by conditioning, from the emotion of rage which Dr. Watson observed in infants whose limbs are not free. Again, we speak of the fall of empires and of fallen women. This is connected with the fear which infants display when left without support. After this excursion into the realm of desire, we can now return to knowledge, which, as we saw, is a term correlative to desire, and applicable to another feature of the same kind of activity. We may say, broadly, that a response to a stimulus of the kind involving desire in the above sense shows knowledge if it leads by the quickest or easiest route to the state of affairs which, in the above sense, is behavioristically the object of desire. Knowledge is thus a matter of degree. The rat, during its progressive improvements in the maze, is gradually acquiring more and more knowledge. Its intelligence quotient, so far as that particular task is concerned, will be the ratio of the time it took on the first trial to the time it takes now to get out of the maze. Another point, if our definition of knowledge is accepted, is that there is no such thing as purely contemplative knowledge. Knowledge exists only in relation to the satisfaction of desire, or, as we say, in the capacity to choose the right means to achieve our ends. But can such a definition as the above really stand? Does it represent at all the sort of thing that would commonly be called knowledge? I think it does in the main, but there is need of some discussion to make this clear. In some cases, the definition is obviously applicable. These are the cases that are analogous to the rat in the maze, the consideration of which leads us to our definition. Do you know the way from Trafalgar Square to St. Pancras? Yes, if you can walk it without taking any wrong turnings. In practice, you can give verbal proof of such knowledge without actually having to walk the distance. But that depends upon the correlation of names with streets, and is part of the process of substituting words for things. There may, it is true, come doubtful cases. I was once on a bus in Whitehall, and my neighbor asked, "What street is this?" I answered him, not without surprise at his ignorance. He then said, "What building is that?" And I replied, "The Foreign Office." To this he retorted, "But I thought the Foreign Office was in Downing Street." This time it was his knowledge that surprised me. Should we say that he knew where the Foreign Office is? The answer is yes or no according to his purpose. From the point of view of sending a letter to it, he knew. From the point of view of walking to it, he did not know. He had, in fact, been a British consul in South America, and was in London for the first time. But now let us come to cases less obviously within the scope of our definition. The reader knows that Columbus crossed the ocean in 1492. What do we mean by saying that he knows this? We mean, no doubt, primarily that writing down this statement is the way to pass examinations, which is just as useful to us as getting out of the maze is to the rat. But we do not mean only this. There is historical evidence of the fact, at least I suppose there is. The historical evidence consists of printed books and manuscripts. Certain rules have been developed by historians as to the conditions in which statements in books or manuscripts may be accepted as true, and the evidence in our case is, I presume, in accordance with these rules. Historical facts often have importance in the present, for example, wills or laws not yet repealed. The rules for weighing historical evidence are such as will, in general, bring out self-consistent results. Two results are self-consistent when, in relation to a desire to which both are relevant, they enjoin the same action or actions which can form part of the one movement towards the goal. At Cotton, near Cambridge, there is, or was in my time, a signpost with two arms pointing in diametrically opposite directions, and each arm said, "To Cambridge." This was a perfect example of self-contradiction, since the two arms made statements representing exactly opposite actions. And this case illustrates why self-contradiction is to be avoided. But the avoidance of self-contradiction makes great demands upon us. Hegel and Bradley imagined that we could know the nature of the universe by means of this principle alone. In this, they were pretty certainly mistaken, but nevertheless, a great deal of our knowledge depends upon this principle to a greater or less extent. Most of our knowledge is like that in a cookery book, maxims to be followed when occasion arises, but not useful at every moment of every day. Since knowledge may be useful at any time, we get gradually, through conditioning, a general desire for knowledge. The learned man who is helpless in practical affairs is analogous to the miser, in that he has become absorbed in a means. It should be observed also that knowledge is neutral as among different purposes. If you know that arsenic is a poison, that enables you equally to avoid it if you wish to remain in health, and to take it if you wish to commit suicide. You cannot judge from a man's conduct in relation to arsenic whether he knows that it is a poison or not, unless you know his desires. He may be tired of life, but avoid arsenic because he has been told that it is a good medicine. In this case, his avoidance of it is evidence of lack of knowledge. But to return to Columbus, surely, the reader will say, Columbus really did cross the Atlantic in 1492, and that is why we call this statement knowledge. This is the definition of truth as correspondence with fact. I think there is an important element of correctness in this definition, but it is an element to be elicited at a later stage, after we have discussed the physical world. And it has the defect, as pragmatists have urged, that there seems no way of getting at facts and comparing them with our beliefs. All that we ever reach consists of other beliefs. I do not offer our present behavioristic and pragmatic definition of knowledge as the only possible one, but I offer it as the one to which we are led if we wish to regard knowledge as something causally important, to be exemplified in our reactions to stimuli. This is the appropriate point of view when we are studying man from without, as we have been doing hitherto. There is, however, within the behaviorist philosophy, one important addition to be made to our definition. We began this chapter with sensitivity, but we went on to the consideration of learned reactions, where the learning depended upon association. But there is another sort of learning, at least it is prima facie another sort, which consists of increase of sensitivity. All sensitivity in animals and human beings must count as a sort of knowledge. That is to say, if an animal behaves in the presence of a stimulus of a certain kind as it would not behave in the absence of that stimulus, then, in an important sense, it has knowledge as regards the stimulus. Now it appears that practice, e.g. in music, very greatly increases sensitivity. We learn to react differently to stimuli which only differ slightly. What is more, we learn to react to differences. A violin player can react with great precision to an interval of a fifth. If the interval is very slightly greater or less, his behavior in tuning is influenced by the difference from a fifth. And as we have already had occasion to notice, we become, through practice, increasingly sensitive to form. All this increased sensitivity must count as increase of knowledge. But in saying this, we are not saying anything inconsistent with our earlier definition of knowledge. Sensitivity is essential to choosing the right reaction in many cases. Take the cookery book again. When it says, take a pinch of salt, a good cook knows how much to take, which is an instance of sensitivity. Accurate scientific observation, which is of great practical importance, depends upon sensitivity. And so do many of our practical dealings with other people. If we cannot feel their moods, we shall always be getting at cross purposes. The extent to which sensitivity is improved by practice is astonishing. Town-bred people do not know whether the weather is warm or cold until they read the weather reports in the paper. An entomologist perceives vastly more beetles in the course of a country walk than other people do. The subtlety with which connoisseurs can distinguish among wines and cigars is the despair of youths who wish to become men of the world. Whether this increase of sensitivity can be accounted for by the law of association, I do not know. In many cases, probably it can. But I think sensitiveness to form, which is the essential element in the more difficult forms of abstract thought, as well as in many other matters, cannot be regarded as derivative from the law of association, but is more analogous to the development of a new sense. I should therefore include improvement in sensitivity as an independent element in the advancement of knowledge, but I do so with some hesitation. The above discussion does not pretend to cover the whole of the ground that has to be covered in discussing the definition of knowledge. There are other points of view which are also necessary to a complete consideration of the question. But these must wait until, after considering the physical world, we come to the discussion of man as viewed from within. End of Chapter 8. End of Part 1. Chapter 9 of Philosophy by Bertrand Russell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 2, The Physical World. Chapter 9, The Structure of the Atom. In all that we have said hitherto on the subject of man from without, we have taken a common sense view of the material world. We have not asked ourselves, what is matter? Is there such a thing, or is the outside world composed of stuff of a different kind? And what light does a correct theory of the physical world throw upon the process of perception? These are questions which we must attempt to answer in the following chapters, and in doing so, the science upon which we must depend is physics. Modern physics, however, is very abstract, and by no means easy to explain in simple language. I shall do my best, but the reader must not blame me too severely if, here and there, he finds some slight difficulty or obscurity. The physical world, both through the theory of relativity and through the most recent doctrines as to the structure of the atom, has become very different from the world of everyday life, and also from that of scientific materialism of the 18th century variety. No philosophy can ignore the revolutionary changes in our physical ideas that the men of science have found necessary. Indeed, it may be said that all traditional philosophies have to be discarded, and we have to start afresh with as little respect as possible for the systems of the past. Our age has penetrated more deeply into the nature of things than any earlier age, and it would be a false modesty to overestimate what can still be learned from the metaphysicians of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. What physics has to say about the matter and the physical world generally, from the standpoint of the philosopher, comes under two main heads. First, the structure of the atom. Second, the theory of relativity. The former was, until recently, the less revolutionary philosophically, though the more revolutionary in physics. Until 1925, theories of the structure of the atom were based upon the old conception of matter as indestructible substance, although this was already regarded as no more than a convenience. Now, owing chiefly to two German physicists, Heisenberg and Schrödinger, the last vestiges of the old solid atom have melted away, and matter has become as ghostly as anything in a spiritualist seance. But before tackling these newer views, it is necessary to understand the much simpler theory which they have displaced. This theory does not, except here and there, take account of the new doctrines on fundamentals that have been introduced by Einstein, and it is much easier to understand than relativity. It explains so much of the facts that, whatever may happen, it must remain a stepping stone to a complete theory of the structure of the atom. Indeed, the newer theories have grown directly out of it, and could hardly have arisen in any other way. We must therefore spend a little time in giving a bare outline, which is the less to be regretted as the theory is in itself fascinating. The theory that matter consists of atoms, i.e. of little bits that cannot be divided, is due to the Greeks, but with them it was only a speculation. The evidence for what is called the atomic theory was derived from chemistry, and the theory itself, in its 19th century form, was mainly due to Dalton. It was found that there were a number of elements, and that other substances were compounds of these elements. Compound substances were found to be composed of molecules, each molecule being composed of atoms of one substance combined with atoms of another, or of the same. A molecule of water consists of two atoms of hydrogen and one atom of oxygen. They can be separated by electrolysis. It was supposed, until radioactivity was discovered, that atoms were indestructible and unchangeable. Substances which were not compounds were called elements. The Russian chemist Mendeleev discovered that the elements can be arranged in a series by means of progressive changes in their properties. In his time, there were gaps in this series, but most of them have since been filled by the discovery of new elements. If all the gaps were filled, there would be 92 elements. Actually, the number known is 87, or, including 3 about which there is still some doubt, 90. The place of an element in this series is called its atomic number. Hydrogen is the first and has the atomic number 1. Helium is the second and has the atomic number 2. Uranium is the last and has the atomic number 92. Perhaps in the stars there are elements with higher atomic numbers, but so far none has been actually observed. The discovery of radioactivity necessitated new views as to atoms. It was found that an atom of one radioactive element can break up into an atom of another element and an atom of helium, and that there is also another way in which it can change. It was found also that there can be different elements having the same place in the series. These are called isotopes. For example, when radium disintegrates, it gives rise, in the end, to a kind of lead, but this is somewhat different from the lead found in lead mines. A great many elements have been shown by Dr. F.W. Aston to be really mixtures of isotopes, which can be sorted out by ingenious methods. All this, but more especially the transmutation of elements in radioactivity, led to the conclusion that what had been called atoms were really complex structures, which could change into atoms of a different sort by losing apart. After various attempts to imagine the structure of an atom, physicists were led to accept the view of Sir Ernest Rutherford, which was further developed by Niels Bohr. In this theory, which, in spite of recent developments, remains substantially correct, all matter is composed of two sorts of units, electrons and protons. All electrons are exactly alike, and all protons are exactly alike. All protons carry a certain amount of positive electricity, and all electrons carry an equal amount of negative electricity. But the mass of a proton is about 1,835 times that of an electron. It takes 1,835 electrons to weigh as much as one proton. Protons repel each other, and electrons repel each other, but an electron and a proton attract each other. Every atom is a structure consisting of electrons and protons. The hydrogen atom, which is the simplest, consists of one proton with one electron going round it as a planet goes round the sun. The electron may be lost and the proton left alone. The atom is then positively electrified. But when it has its electron, it is, as a whole, electrically neutral, since the positive electricity of the proton is exactly balanced by the negative electricity of the electron. The second element, helium, has already a much more complicated structure. It has a nucleus consisting of 4 protons and 2 electrons very close together, and in its normal state it has 2 planetary electrons going around the nucleus. But it may lose either or both of these, and it is then positively electrified. All the latter elements consist, like helium, of a nucleus composed of protons and electrons, and a number of planetary electrons going around the nucleus. There are more protons than electrons in the nucleus, but the excess is balanced by the planetary electrons when the atom is unelectrified. The number of protons in the nucleus gives the atomic weight of the element. The excess of protons over the electrons in the nucleus gives the atomic number, which is also the number of planetary electrons when the atom is unelectrified. Uranium, the last element, has 238 protons and 146 electrons in the nucleus, and when unelectrified it has 92 planetary electrons. The arrangement of the planetary electrons in atoms other than hydrogen is not accurately known, but it is clear that in some sense they form different rings, those in the outer rings being more easily lost than those nearer the nucleus. I come now to what Bohr added to the theory of atoms as developed by Rutherford. This was a most curious discovery, introducing in a new field a certain type of discontinuity which was already known to be exhibited by some other natural processes. No adage had seemed more respectable in philosophy than natura non facit saltum, nature makes no jumps. But if there is one thing more than another that the experience of a long life has taught me, it is that Latin tags always express falsehoods, and so it is proved in this case. Apparently, nature does make jumps, not only now and then, but whenever a body emits light, as well as on certain other occasions. The German physicist Planck was the first to demonstrate the necessity of jumps. He was considering how bodies radiate heat when they are warmer than their surroundings. Heat, as has long been known, consists of vibrations, which are distinguished by their frequency, i.e., by the number of vibrations per second. Planck showed that for vibrations having a given frequency, not all amounts of energy are possible, but only those having to the frequency a ratio which is a certain quantity, h, multiplied by 1, or 2, or 3, or some other whole number. In practice, always a small whole number. The quantity h is known as Planck's constant. It has turned out to be involved practically everywhere where measurement is delicate enough to know whether it is involved or not. It is such a small quantity that, except where measurement can reach a very high degree of accuracy, the departure from continuity is not appreciable. Footnote: the dimensions of h are those of action, i.e. energy multiplied by time, or moment of momentum, or mass multiplied by length multiplied by velocity. Its magnitude is about 6.55 times 10.27 erg-secs. End footnote. Bohr's great discovery was that this same quantity, h, is involved in the orbits of the planetary electrons in atoms, and that it limits the possible orbits in ways for which nothing in Newtonian dynamics had prepared us, and for which, so far, there is nothing in relativity dynamics to account. According to Newtonian principles, an electron ought to be able to go round the nucleus in any circle with the nucleus in the center, or in any ellipse with the nucleus in a focus. Among possible orbits, it would select one or another according to its direction and velocity. But in fact, only certain out of all these orbits occur. Those that occur are among those that are possible on Newtonian principles, but are only an infinitesimal selection from among these. It will simplify the explanation if we confine ourselves, as Bohr did at first, to circular orbits. Moreover, we will consider only the hydrogen atom, which has one planetary electron and a nucleus consisting of one proton. To define the circular orbits that are found to be possible, we proceed as follows. Multiply the mass of the electron by the circumference of its orbit, and this again by the velocity of the electron. The result will always be h, or 2h, or 3h, or some other small exact multiple of h, where h, as before, is Planck's constant. There is thus a smallest possible orbit, in which the above product is h. The radius of the next orbit, in which the above product is 2h, will have a length 4 times this minimum. The next, 9 times. The next, 16 times. And so on through the square numbers, i.e. those got by multiplying a number by itself. Apparently, no other circular orbits than these are possible in the hydrogen atom. Elliptic orbits are possible, but these again introduce exact multiples of h. But we need not, for our purpose, concern ourselves with them. When a hydrogen atom is left to itself, if the electron is in the minimum orbit, it will continue to rotate in that orbit, so long as nothing from outside disturbs it. But if the electron is in any of the larger possible orbits, it may, sooner or later, jump suddenly to a smaller orbit, either the minimum or one of the intermediate possible orbits. So long as the electron does not change its orbit, the atom does not radiate energy. But when the electron jumps to a smaller orbit, the atom loses energy, which is radiated out in the form of a light wave. This light wave is always such that its energy divided by its frequency is exactly h. The atom may absorb energy from without, and it does so by the electron jumping to a larger orbit. It may then afterwards, when the external source of energy is removed, jump back to the smaller orbit. This is the cause of fluorescence, since, in doing so, the atom gives out energy in the form of light. The same principles, with greater mathematical complications, apply to other elements. There is, however, with some of the later elements, a phenomenon which cannot have any analog in hydrogen, and that is radioactivity. When an atom is radioactive, it emits rays of 3 kinds, called respectively alpha rays, beta rays, and gamma rays. Of these, the gamma rays are analogous to light, but of much higher frequencies, or shorter wavelengths. We need not further concern ourselves with them. The alpha rays and beta rays, on the contrary, are important as our chief source of knowledge concerning the nuclei of atoms. It is found that the alpha rays consist of helium nuclei, while the beta rays consist of electrons. Both come out of the nucleus, since the atom, after radioactivity disruption, is a different element from what it was before. But no one knows just why the nucleus disintegrates when it does, nor why, in a piece of radium, for example, some atoms break down, while others do not. The 3 principal sources of our knowledge concerning atoms have been the light they emit, X-rays, and radioactivity. As everyone knows, when the light emitted by a glowing gas is passed through a prism, it is found to consist of well-defined lines of different colors, which are characteristic for each element and constitute what is called its spectrum. The spectrum extends beyond the range of visible light, both into the infrared and into the ultraviolet. In the latter direction, it extends right into the region of X-rays, which are only ultraviolet light. By means of crystals, it has been found possible to study X-ray spectra as exactly as those of ordinary light. The great merit of Bohr's theory was that it explained why elements have the spectra they do have, which had before been a complete mystery. In the cases of hydrogen and positively electrified helium, the explanation, particularly as extended by the German physicist Sommerfeld, gave the most minute numerical agreement between theory and observation. In other cases, mathematical difficulties have made this completeness impossible. But there was every reason to think that the same principles were adequate. This was the main reason for accepting Bohr's theory, and certainly it was a very strong one. It was found that visible light enabled us to study the outer rings of planetary electrons, X-rays enabled us to study the inner rings, and radioactivity enabled us to study the nucleus. For the latter purpose, there are also other methods, more particularly Rutherford's bombardment, which aims at breaking up nuclei by firing projectiles at them, and sometimes succeeds in making a hit, in spite of the smallness of the target. The theory of atomic structure that has just been outlined, like everything in theoretical physics, is capable of expression in mathematical formulae, but like many things in theoretical physics, it is also capable of expression in the form of an imaginative picture. But here, as always, it is necessary to distinguish sharply between the mathematical symbols and the pictorial words. The symbols are pretty sure to be right, or nearly so. The imaginative picture, on the other hand, should not be taken too seriously. When we consider the nature of the evidence upon which the above theory of the atom is based, we can see that the attempt to make a picture of what goes on has led us to be far more concrete than we have any right to be. If we want to assert only what we have good reason to believe, we shall have to abandon the attempt to be concrete about what goes on in the atom, and say merely something like this. An atom, with its electrons, is a system characterized by certain integers, all small, and all capable of changing independently. These integers are the multiples of h involved. When any of them changes into a smaller integer, energy of a definite amount is emitted, and its frequency will be obtained by dividing the energy of h. When any of the integers concerned changes to a larger integer, energy is absorbed, and again the amount absorbed is definite. But we cannot know what goes on when the atom is neither absorbing nor radiating energy, since then it has no effects in surrounding regions. Consequently, all evidence as to atoms is as to their changes, not as to their steady states. The point is not that the facts do not fit with the hypothesis of the atom as a planetary system. There are, it is true, certain difficulties which afford empirical grounds for the newer theory which has superseded Bohr's, and which we shall shortly consider. But even if no such grounds existed, it would be obvious that Bohr's theory states more than we have a right to infer from what we can observe. Of theories that state so much, there must be an infinite number that are compatible with what is known, and it is only what all of these have in common that we are really entitled to assert. Suppose your knowledge of Great Britain were entirely confined to observing the people and goods that enter and leave the ports. You could, in that case, invent many theories as to the interior of Great Britain, all of which would agree with all known facts. This is an exact analogy. If you delimit in the physical universe any region, large or small, not containing a scientific observer, all scientific observers will have exactly the same experiences, whatever happens inside this region, provided it does not affect the flow of energy across the boundary of the region. And so, if the region contains one atom, any two theories which give the same results as to the energy that the atom radiates or absorbs are empirically indistinguishable, and there can be no reason except simplicity for preferring one of them to the other. On this ground, even if on no other, prudence compels us to seek a more abstract theory of the atom than that which we owe to Rutherford and Bohr. The newer theory has been put forward mainly by two physicists already mentioned, Heisenberg and Schrödinger, in forms which look different, but are in fact mathematically equivalent. It is, as yet, an impossible task to describe this theory in simple language, but something can be said to show its philosophical bearing. Broadly speaking, it describes the atom by means of the radiations that come out of it. In Bohr's theory, the planetary electrons are supposed to describe orbits over and over again while the atom is not radiating. In the newer theory, we say nothing at all to what happens at these times. The aim is to confine the theory to what is empirically verifiable, mainly radiations. As to what there is where the radiations come from, we cannot tell, and it is scientifically unnecessary to speculate. The theory requires modifications in our conception of space, of a sort not yet quite clear. It also has the consequence that we cannot identify an electron at one time with an electron at another, if in the interval the atom has radiated energy. The electron ceases altogether to have the properties of a thing as conceived by common sense. It is merely a region from which energy may radiate. On the subject of discontinuity, there is disagreement between Schrödinger and other physicists. Most of them maintain that quantum changes, i.e. the changes that occur in an atom when it radiates or absorbs energy, must be discontinuous. Schrödinger thinks otherwise. This is a matter in debate among experts, as to which it would be rash to venture an opinion. Probably it will be decided one way or other before very long. The main point for the philosopher in the modern theory is the disappearance of matter as a thing. It has been replaced by emanations from a locality, the sort of influences that characterize haunted rooms and ghost stories. As we shall see in the next chapter, the theory of relativity leads to a similar destruction of the solidity of matter by a different line of argument. All sorts of events happen in the physical world, but tables and chairs, the sun and moon, and even our daily bread have become pale abstractions, mere laws exhibited in the succession of events which radiate from certain regions. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Philosophy by Bertrand Russell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Relativity. We have seen that the world of the atom is a world of revolution rather than evolution. The electron, which has been moving in one orbit, hops quite suddenly into another, so that the motion is what is called discontinuous. That is to say, the electron is first in one place and then in another, without having passed over any intermediate places. This sounds like magic, and there may be some way of avoiding such a disconcerting hypothesis. At any rate, nothing of the sort seems to happen in the regions where there are no electrons and protons. In these regions, so far as we can discover, there is continuity. That is to say, everything goes by gradual transitions, not by jumps. The regions in which there are no electrons and protons may be called ether or empty space, as you prefer. The difference is only verbal. The theory of relativity is especially concerned with what goes on in these regions, as opposed to what goes on where there are electrons and protons. Apart from the theory of relativity, what we know about these regions is that waves travel across them, and that these waves, when they are waves of light or electromagnetism, which are identical, behave in a certain fashion set forth by Maxwell in certain formulae called Maxwell's equations. When I say we know this, I am saying more than is strictly correct, because all we know is what happens when the waves reach our bodies. It is as if we could not see the sea, but could only see the people disembarking at Dover, and inferred the waves from the fact that the people looked green. It is obvious, in any case, that we can know only so much about the waves as is involved in their having such and such causes at one end, and such effects at the other. What can be inferred in this way will be, at best, something wholly expressible in terms of mathematical structure. We must not think of the waves as being necessarily in the ether or in anything else. They are to be thought of merely as progressive periodic processes, whose laws are more or less known, but whose intrinsic character is not known and never can be. The theory of relativity has arisen from the study of what goes on in the regions where there are no electrons and protons. While the study of the atom has led us to discontinuities, relativity has produced a completely continuous theory of the intervening medium, far more continuous than any theory formerly imagined. At the moment, these 2 points of view stand more or less opposed to each other, but no doubt before long they will be reconciled. There is not, even now, any logical contradiction between them. There is only a fairly complete lack of connection. For philosophy, Far the most important thing about the theory of relativity is the abolition of the one cosmic time and the one persistent space, and the substitution of space-time in place of both. This is a change of quite enormous importance, because it alters fundamentally our notion of the structure of the physical world, and has, I think, repercussions in psychology. It would be useless, in our day, to talk about philosophy without explaining this matter. Therefore, I shall make the attempt, in spite of some difficulty. Common sense and pre-relativity physicists believe that if two events happen in different places, there must always be a definite answer, in theory, to the question whether they were simultaneous. This is found to be a mistake. Let us suppose two persons, A and B, a long way apart, each provided with a mirror and means of sending out light signals. The events that happen to A still have a perfectly definite time order, and so have those that happen to B. The difficulty comes in connecting A's time with B's. Suppose A sends a flash to B. B's mirror reflects it, and it returns to A after a certain time. If A is on the Earth and B on the Sun, the time will be about 16 minutes. We shall naturally say that the time when B received the light signal is halfway between the times when A sent it out and received it back. But this definition tends to be not unambiguous. It will depend upon how A and B are moving relatively to each other. The more this difficulty is examined, the more insuperable it is seen to be. Anything that happens to A after he sends out the flash and before he gets it back is neither definitely before, nor definitely after, nor definitely simultaneous with the arrival of the flash at B. To this extent, there is no unambiguous way of correlating times in different places. The notion of a place is also quite vague. Is London a place? But the Earth is rotating. Is the Earth a place? But it is going round the sun. Is the sun a place? But it is moving relatively to the stars. At best, you could talk of a place at a given time, but then it is ambiguous what is a given time, unless you confine yourself to one place. So the notion of place evaporates. We naturally think of the universe as being in one state at one time and in another at another. This is a mistake. There is no cosmic time, and so we cannot speak of the state of the universe at a given time. And similarly, we cannot speak unambiguously of the distance between two bodies at a given time. If we take the time appropriate to one of the two bodies, we shall get one estimate. If the time of the other, another. This makes the Newtonian law of gravitation ambiguous, and shows that it needs restatement independently of empirical evidence. Geometry also goes wrong. A straight line, for example, is supposed to be a certain track in space whose parts all exist simultaneously. We shall now find that what is a straight line for one observer is not a straight line for another. Therefore, geometry ceases to be separable from physics. The observer need not be a mind, but may be a photographic plate. The peculiarities of the observer in this region belong to physics, not to psychology. So long as we continue to think in terms of bodies moving, and try to adjust this way of thinking to the new ideas by successive corrections, we shall only get more and more confused. The only way to get clear is to make a fresh start, with events instead of bodies. In physics, an event is anything which, according to the old notions, would be said to have both a date and a place. An explosion, a flash of lightning, the starting of a light wave from an atom, the arrival of the light wave at some other body, any of these would be an event. Some strings of events make up what we regard as the history of one body. Some make up the course of one light wave, and so on. The unity of a body is a unit of history. It is like the unity of a tune, which takes time to play and does not exist whole in any one moment. What exists at any one moment is only what we call an event. It may be that the word event, as used in physics, cannot be quite identified with the same word as used in psychology. For the present, we are concerned with events as the constituents of physical processes, and need not trouble ourselves about events in psychology. The events in the physical world have relations to each other which are of the sort that have led to the notions of space and time. They have relations of order, so that we can say that one event is nearer to a second than to a third. In this way, we can arrive at the notion of the neighborhood of an event. It will consist, roughly speaking, of all the events that are very near the given event. When we say that neighboring events have a certain relation, we shall mean that the nearer two events are to each other, the more nearly they have this relation, and that they approximate to having it without limit as they are taken nearer and nearer together. Two neighboring events have a measurable quantitative relation called interval, which is sometimes analogous to distance in space, sometimes to lapse of time. In the former case, it is called space-like, in the latter, time-like. The interval between two events is time-like when one body might be present in both. For example, when both are parts of the history of your body. The interval is space-like in the contrary case. In the marginal case between the two, the interval is zero. This happens when both are parts of one light ray. The interval between two neighboring events is something objective, in the sense that any two careful observers will arrive at the same estimate of it. They will not arrive at the same estimate for the distance in space or the lapse of time between the two events, but the interval is a genuine physical fact, the same for all. If a body can travel freely from one event to the other, the interval between the two events will be the same as the time between them, as measured by a clock traveling with the body. If such a journey is physically impossible, the interval will be the same as the distance as estimated by an observer to whom the two events are simultaneous. But the interval is only definite when the two events are very near together. Otherwise, the interval depends upon the whole route chosen for traveling from the one event to the other. Four numbers are needed to fix the position of an event in the world. These correspond to the time and the three dimensions of space in the old reckoning. These four numbers are called the coordinates of the event. They may be assigned on any principle which gives neighboring coordinates to neighboring events. Subject to this condition, they are merely conventional. For example, suppose an airplane has had an accident. You can fix the position of the accident by four numbers: latitude, longitude, altitude above sea level, and Greenwich Mean Time. But you cannot fix the position of the explosion in space-time by means of less than four numbers. Everything in relativity theory goes, in a sense, from next to next. There are no direct relations between distant events, such as distance in time or space. And of course, there are no forces acting in a distance. In fact, except as a convenient fiction, there are no forces at all. Bodies take the course which is easiest at each moment, according to the character of space-time in the particular region where they are. This course is called a geodesic. Now, it will be observed that I have been speaking freely of bodies in motion, although I said that bodies were merely certain strings of events. That being so, it is of course necessary to say what strings of events constitute bodies, since not all continuous strings of events do so, not even all geodesics. Until we have defined the sort of thing that makes a body, we cannot legitimately speak of motion, since this involves the presence of one body on different occasions. We must therefore set to work to define what we mean by the persistence of a body, and how a string of events constituting a body differs from one which does not. This topic will occupy the next chapter. But it may be useful, as a preliminary, to teach our imagination to work in accordance with the new ideas. We must give up what Whitehead admirably calls the pushiness of matter. We naturally think of an atom as being like a billiard ball. We should do better to think of it as like a ghost, which has no pushiness and yet can make you fly. We have to change our notions, both of substance and of cause. To say that an atom persists is like saying that a tune persists. If a tune takes 5 minutes to play, we do not conceive of it as a single thing which exists throughout that time, but as a series of notes, so related as to form a unity. In the case of the tune, the unity is aesthetic. In the case of the atom, it is causal. But when I say causal, I do not mean exactly what the word naturally conveys. There must be no idea of compulsion or force, neither the force of contact, which we imagine we see between billiard balls, nor the action at a distance, which was formerly supposed to constitute gravitation. There is merely an observed law of succession from next to next. An event at one moment is succeeded by an event at a neighboring moment, which, to the first order of small quantities, can be calculated from the earlier event. This enables us to construct a string of events, each approximately growing out of a slightly earlier event according to an intrinsic law. Outside influences only affect the second order of small quantities. A string of events connected in this way by an approximate intrinsic law of development is called one piece of matter. This is what I mean by saying that the unity of a piece of matter is causal. I shall explain this notion more fully in later chapters. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Philosophy by Bertrand Russell. The LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Causal laws in physics. In the last chapter, we spoke about the substitution of space-time for space and time, and the effect which this has had in substituting strings of events for things conceived as substances. In this chapter, we will deal with cause and effect as they appear in the light of modern science. It is at least as difficult to purge our imagination of irrelevances in this matter as in regard to substance. The old-fashioned notion of cause appeared in dynamics as force. We still speak of forces just as we still speak of the sunrise, but we recognize that this is nothing but a convenient way of speaking, in the one case as in the other. Causation is deeply embedded in language and common sense. We say that people build houses or make roads. To build and to make are both notions involving causality. We say that a man is powerful, meaning that his volitions are causes over a wide range. Some examples of causation seem to us quite natural, others less so. It seems natural that our muscles should obey our will, and only reflection makes us perceive the necessity of finding an explanation of this phenomenon. It seems natural that when you hit a billiard ball with a cue, it moves. When we see a horse pulling a cart or a heavy object being dragged by a rope, we feel as if we understood all about it. It is events of this sort that have given rise to the common sense belief in causes and forces. But as a matter of fact, the world is incredibly more complicated than it seems to common sense. When we think we understand a process, I mean by we, the non-reflective part in each of us, what really happens is that there is some sequence of events so familiar through past experience that at each stage we expect the next stage. The whole process seems to us peculiarly intelligible when human desires enter in. For example, in watching a game. What the ball does and what the players do seem natural, and we feel as if we quite understand how the stages succeed each other. We thus arrive at the notion of what is called necessary sequence. The textbooks say that A is the cause of B if A is necessarily followed by B. This notion of necessity seems to be purely anthropomorphic and is not based upon anything that is a discoverable feature of the world. Things happen according to certain rules. The rules can be generalized, but in the end remain brute facts. Unless the rules are concealed conventions or definitions, no reason can be given why they should not be completely different. To say that A is necessarily followed by B is thus to say no more than that there is some general rule, exemplified in a very large number of observed instances and falsified in none, according to which events such as A are followed by events such as B. We must not have any notion of compulsion, as if the cause forced the effect to happen. A good test for the imagination in this respect is the reversibility of causal laws. We can just as often infer backwards as forwards. When you get a letter, you are justified in inferring that somebody wrote it, but you do not feel that your receiving it compelled the sender to write it. The notion of compulsion is just as little applicable to effects as to causes. To say that causes compel effects is as misleading as to say effects compel causes. Compulsion is anthropomorphic. A man is compelled to do something when he wishes to do the opposite, but except where human or animal wishes come in, the notion of compulsion is inapplicable. Science is concerned merely with what happens, not with what must happen. When we look for invariable rules of sequence in nature, we find that they are not such as common sense sets up. Common sense says, thunder follows lightning, waves at sea follow wind, and so on. Rules of this sort are indispensable in practical life, but in science they are all only approximate. If there is any finite interval of time, however short, between the cause and the effect, something may happen to prevent the effect from occurring. Scientific laws can only be expressed in differential equations. This means that, although you cannot tell what may happen after a finite time, you can say that, if you make the time shorter and shorter, what will happen will be more and more nearly according to such and such a rule. To take a very simple case, I am now in this room. You cannot tell where I shall be in another second, because a bomb may explode and blow me sky high. But if you take any two small fragments of my body, which are now very close together, you can be sure that after some very short finite time, they will still be very close together. If a second is not short enough, you must take a shorter time. You cannot tell in advance how short a time you may have to take, but you may feel fairly certain that there is a short enough time. The laws of sequence in physics, apart from quantum phenomena, are of two sorts, which appeared in traditional dynamics as laws of velocity and laws of acceleration. In a very short time, the velocity of a body alters very little, and if the time is taken short enough, the change of velocity diminishes without limit. This is what, in the last chapter, we called an intrinsic causal law. Then there is the effect of the outer world, as it appeared in traditional dynamics, which is shown in acceleration. The small change which does occur in the velocity in a short time is attributed to surrounding bodies, because it is found to vary as they vary, and to vary according to ascertained laws. Thus, we think of surrounding bodies as exerting an influence, which we call force, though this remains as mysterious as the influence of the stars in astrology. Einstein's theory of gravitation has done away with this conception insofar as gravitational forces are concerned. In this theory, a planet moving round the sun is moving in the nearest approach to a straight line that the neighborhood permits. The neighborhood is supposed to be non-Euclidean, that is to say, to contain no straight line such as Euclid imagined. If a body is moving freely, as the planets do, it observes a certain rule. Perhaps the simplest way to state this rule is as follows. Suppose you take any two events which happen on the Earth, and you measure the time between them by ideally accurate clocks which move with the Earth. Suppose some traveler on a magic carpet had meanwhile cruised about the universe, leaving the Earth at the time of the first event and returning at the time of the second. By his clocks, the period elapsed will be less than by the terrestrial clocks. This is what is meant by saying that the Earth moves in a geodesic, which is the nearest approach to a straight line to be found in the region in which we live. All this is, so to speak, geometrical, and involves no forces. It is not the sun that makes the Earth go round, but the nature of space-time, or the Earth, is. Even this is not quite correct. Space-time does not make the Earth go round the sun. It makes us say the Earth goes round the sun. That is to say, it makes this the shortest way of describing what occurs. We could describe it in other language, which would be equally correct, but less convenient. The abolition of force in astronomy is perhaps connected with the fact that astronomy depends only upon the sense of sight. On the Earth, we push and pull, we touch things, and we experience muscular strains. This all gives us a notion of force, but this notion is anthropomorphic. To imagine the laws of motion of heavenly bodies, think of the motions of objects in a mirror. They may move very fast, although in the mirror world there are no forces. What we really have to substitute for force is laws of correlation. Events can be collected in groups by their correlations. This is all that is true in the old notion of causality, and this is not a postulate or category, but an observed fact. Lucky, not necessary. As we suggested before, it is these correlations of events that lead to the definition of permanent things. There is no essential difference, as regards substantiality, between an electron and a light ray. Each is really a string of events, or of sets of events. In the case of the light ray, we have no temptation to think otherwise. But in the case of the electron, we think of it as a single, persistent entity. There may be such an entity, but we can have no evidence that there is. What we can discover is A, a group of events spreading outwards from a center, say, for definiteness, the events constituting a wave of light, and attributed hypothetically to a cause in that center. B, more or less similar groups of events at other times, connected with the first group according to the laws of physics, and therefore attributed to the same hypothetical cause at other times. But all that we ought to assume is series of groups of events, connected by discoverable laws. These series we may define as matter. Whether there is matter in any other sense, no one can tell. What is true in the old notion of causality is the fact that events at different times are connected by laws, differential equations. When there is a law connecting an event A with an event B, the two have a definite, unambiguous time order. But if the events are such that a ray of light starting from A would arrive at any body which was present at B after B had occurred, and vice versa, then there is no definite true order, and no possible causal law connecting A and B. A and B must then be regarded as separate facts of geography. Perhaps the scope and purpose of this and the foregoing chapters may be made clearer by showing their bearing upon certain popular beliefs, which may seem self-evident, but are really, in my opinion, either false or likely to lead to falsehood. I shall confine myself to objections which have actually been made to me when trying to explain the philosophical outcome of modern physics. Footnote. These objections are quoted, with kind permission, from a letter written to me by a well-known engineer, Mr. Percy Griffith, who is also a writer on philosophical subjects. End footnote. We cannot conceive of movement apart from some thing as moving. This is, in a sense, a truism, but in the sense in which it is usually meant, it is a falsehood. We speak of the movement of a drama or a piece of music, although we do not conceive either as a thing which exists complete at every moment of the performance. This is the sort of picture we must have in our minds when we try to conceive the physical world. We must think of a string of events, connected together by certain causal connections, and having enough unity to deserve a single name. We then begin to imagine that the single name denotes a single thing, and if the events concerned are not all in the same place, we may say the thing has moved. But this is only a convenient shorthand. In the cinema, we seem to see a man falling off a skyscraper, catching hold of the telegraph wires, and reaching the ground none the worse. We know that in fact there are a number of different photographs, and the appearance of a single thing moving is deceptive. In this respect, the real world resembles the cinema. In connection with motion, one needs to emphasize the very difficult distinction between experience and prejudice. Experience, roughly, is what you see, and prejudice is what you only think you see. Prejudice tells us that you see the same table on two different occasions. You think that experience tells you this. If it really were experience, you could not be mistaken. Yet a similar table may be substituted without altering the experience. If you look at a table on two different occasions, you have very similar sensations, and memory tells you that they are similar, but there is nothing to show that one identical entity causes the two sensations. If the table is in a cinema, you know that there is not such an entity, even though you can watch it changing with apparent continuity. The experience is just like that with a real table. So, in the case of the real table also, there is nothing in the actual experience to show whether there is a persistent entity or not. I say, therefore, I do not know whether there is a persistent entity, but I do know that my experiences can be explained without assuming that there is. Therefore, it can be no part of legitimate science to assert or deny the persistent entity. If it does either, it goes beyond the warrant of experience. The following is a verbally cited passage in the letter referred to, objecting to what was said above about force. The concept of force is not of physical but of psychological origin. Rightly or wrongly, it arises in the most impersonal contemplation of the stellar universe, where we observe an infinite number of spherical bodies revolving on their own axes and gyrating in orbits round each other. Rightly or wrongly, we naturally conceive of these as having been so constituted and so maintained by some force or forces. We do not, in fact, observe what it is here said that we observe. All this is inferred. What we observe in astronomy is a two-dimensional pattern of points of light, with a few bright surfaces of measurable size when seen through the telescope, the planets, and of course the larger bright surfaces that we call the sun and the moon. Most of this pattern, the fixed stars, rotates round the Earth once in every 23 hours and 56 minutes. The sun rotates in varying periods, which average 24 hours and never departs very far from the average. The moon and planets have apparent motions which are more irregular. These are observed facts. There is no logical impossibility about the formulae doctrine of spheres rotating round the Earth, one for each planet and one for the stars. The modern doctrines are simpler, but not one whit more in accordance with observed facts. It is our passion for simple laws that has made us adopt them. The last sentence of the above quotation raises some further points of interest. Rightly or wrongly, the writer says, we naturally conceive of these as having been so constituted and so maintained by some force or forces. I do not deny this. It is natural, and it is right or wrong. More specifically, it is wrong. Force is part of our love of explanations. Everyone knows about the Hindu who thought that the world does not fall because it is supported by an elephant, and the elephant does not fall because it is supported by a tortoise. When his European interlocutor said, "But how about the tortoise?" he replied that he was tired of metaphysics and wanted to change the subject. Force, as an explanation, is no better than the elephant and the tortoise. It is an attempt to get at the why of natural processes, not only at the how. What we observe, to a limited extent, is what happens, and we can arrive at laws according to which observable things happen, but we cannot arrive at a reason for the laws. If we invent a reason, it needs a reason in its turn, and so on. Force is a rationalizing of natural processes, but a fruitless one, since force would have to be rationalized also. When it is said, as it often is, that
Hi.
force belongs to the
Jett, are you being a good boy?
we must be careful
Come on, Willa.
what can be meant.
All the way inside.
It may be meant that calculations which employ the notion of force work out right.
think so.
Oh, good.
Can you hold that for just a second?
All right.
British medical man renders his absence in goodness, although in a large sense seems to exist except as a illness. He obtains a real payment, though he employs a fictitious form. Similarly, the engineer is concerned with the question whether his bridge will stand. The fact of experience is that it stands or does not stand, and that the stresses and strains are only a way of explaining what sort of bridge will stand. They are useful as things, but equally imaginary. But when it is said that force is a fact of experience, there is something quite different that may be meant. It may be meant that we experience force when we experience such things as pressure or muscular exertion. We cannot discuss this convention adequately without going into the relation of physics to psychology, which is a topic we shall consider at length at a later stage. We may say this much. If you press your fingertip upon a hard object, you have an experience which you attribute to your fingertip. But there is a long chain of intermediate causes in nerves and brain. If your finger were amputated, you could still have the same experience by a suitable operation on the nerves that formerly connected the finger with the brain, so that the force between the fingertip and the hard object, the fact of experience, may exist when there is no fingertip. This shows that force, in this sense, cannot be what concerns physics. As the above example illustrates, we do not, in fact, experience many things that we think we experience. This makes it necessary to ask, without too much assurance, in what sense physics can be based upon experience, and what must be the nature of its entities and its inferences if it is to make good its claim to be empirically grounded. We shall begin this inquiry in the next chapter. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Philosophy by Bertrand Russell. The Superfox recording is in the public domain. Physics and Perception. It will be remembered that we regarded perception in Chapter 5 as a species of sensitivity. Sensitivity to a given feature of the environment we defined as consisting in some characteristic reaction which is exhibited whenever that feature is present, but not otherwise. This property is possessed more perfectly, in given directions, by scientific instruments than by living bodies, though scientific instruments are more selective as to the stimuli to which they will respond. We decided that what, from the standpoint of an external observer, distinguishes perception from other forms of sensitivity is the law of association, or conditioned reflexes. But we also found that this purely external treatment of perception presupposes our knowledge of the physical world as a going concern. We have now to investigate this presupposition and to consider how we come to know about physics and how much we really do know.
Hey, babe.
According to the theory of
You want
Chapter 5,
canine aspirin
it
today
is
at all?
possible to perceive
Either
things that are not in a spatial contact with the body. There must be a reaction to a feature of the environment, but that feature may be at a greater or less distance from the body of the percipient. We can even perceive the sun and stars within the limits of the definition. All that is necessary is that our reaction should depend upon the spatial relation between our body and the feature of the environment. When our back is towards the sun, we do not see it. When our face is towards it, we do. When we consider perception, visual or auditory, of an external event, there are three different matters to be examined. There is first the process in the outside world, from the event to the recipient's body. There is next the process in his body, insofar as this can be known by an outside observer. Lastly, there is the question, which must be faced sooner or later, whether the recipient can perceive something of the process in his body which no other observer could perceive. We will take these points in order. If it is to be possible to perceive an event not in the recipient's body, there must be a physical process in the outer world such that When a certain event occurs, it produces a stimulus of a certain kind at the surface of the percipient's body. Suppose, for example, that pictures of different animals are exhibited on a magic lantern to a class of children, and all the children are asked to say the name of each animal in turn. We may assume that the children are sufficiently familiar with animals to say cat, dog, giraffe, hippopotamus, etc. at the right moments. We must then suppose, taking the physical world for granted, that some process travels from each picture to the eyes of the various children, retaining throughout these journeys such peculiarities that when the process reaches their eyes, it can, in one case, stimulate the word cat, and in another, the word dog. All this, the physical theory of light provides for. But there is one interesting point about language that should get noticed in this connection. If the usual physical theory of light is correct, the various children receive stimuli which differ greatly according to their distance and direction from the picture, and according to the way the light falls. There are also differences in their reactions, for though they all utter the word cat, some say it loud, others soft, some in a soprano voice, some in a contralto. But the differences in their reactions are much less than the differences in the stimuli. This is still more the case if we consider various different pictures of cats, to all of which they respond with the word cat. Thus, language is a means of producing responses which differ less than the stimuli do, in cases where the resemblances between the stimuli are more important to us than the differences. This fact makes us apt to overlook the differences between stimuli which produce nearly identical responses. As appears from the above, when a number of people simultaneously perceive a picture of a cat, there are differences between the stimuli to their various perceptions, and these differences must obviously involve differences in their reactions. The verbal responses may differ very little, but even the verbal responses could be made to differ by putting more complicated questions than merely, what animal is that? One could ask, can the picture be covered by your thumbnail held at arm's length? Then the answer would be different according as the recipient was near the picture or far off. But the normal recipient, if left to himself, will not notice such differences. That is to say, his verbal response will be the same in spite of the differences in the stimuli. The fact that it is possible for a number of people to perceive the same noise or the same colored pattern obviously depends upon the fact that a physical process can travel outward from a center and retain certain of its characteristics unchanged, or very little changed. The most notable of such characteristics is frequency in a wave motion. That, no doubt, affords a biological reason for the fact that our most delicate senses, sight and hearing, are sensitive to frequencies, which determine color in what we see and pitch in what we hear. If there were not, in the physical world, processes spreading out from centers and retaining certain characters practically unchanged, it would be impossible for different percipients to perceive the same object from different points of view, and we should not have been able to discover that we all live in a common world. We come now to the process in the percipient's body, insofar as this can be perceived by an outside observer. This raises no new philosophical problems, because we are still concerned, as before, with the perception of events outside the observer's body. The observer, now, is supposed to be a physiologist, observing, say, what goes on in the eye when light falls upon it. His means of knowing are, in principle, exactly the same as in the observation of dead matter. An event in an eye upon which light is falling causes light waves to travel in a certain manner until they reach the eye of the physiologist. There they cause a process in the physiologist's eye and optic nerve and brain, which ends in what he calls seeing what happens in the eye he is observing. But this event, which happens in the physiologist, is not what happened in the eye he was observing. It is only connected with this by a complicated causal chain. Thus, our knowledge of physiology is no more direct or intimate than our knowledge of processes in dead matter. We do not know any more about our eye than about the trees and fields and clouds that we see by means of them. The event which happens when a physiologist observes an eye is an event in him, not on the eye that he is observing. We come now at last to the question of self-observation, which we have hitherto avoided. I say self-observation rather than introspection, because the latter word has controversial associations that I wish to avoid. I mean by self-observation anything that a man can perceive about himself, but that others, however situated, cannot perceive about him. What follows is